So earlier this week, Modular sent me a video, and then I
Uh-huh.
watched the video, and I was like, man, that Elizabeth Warren lady sure is cool and awesome. Wonder why Modular sent me a video of Elizabeth Warren being cool and awesome. And
Let's
then
watch it, and I'll tell you why.
apparently he doesn't think she was being cool and awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Fed has raised interest rates 8 times over the last year in what has been the most extreme rate hike cycle in 40 years. The Fed's goal is to slow inflation, and your tool, raising interest rates, is designed to slow the economy and throw people out of work. So far, you haven't tipped the economy into recession, but you haven't brought inflation entirely under control either. And maybe the reason for that is that other things are also keeping prices high, things you can't fix with high interest rates, things like price gouging and supply chain kinks and a war in Ukraine. But you are determined to continue to raise interest rates, so I want to take a look at where you're headed. In December, the Fed released its projections on the state of the economy under your monetary policy plan. According to the Fed's own report, if you continue raising interest rates as you plan, unemployment will be 4.6% by the end of the year, more than a full point higher than it is today. Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an
just a math
intended
problem.
consequence. It's
Well,
not.
but it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs, people who are working right now, making their mortgages. So, Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs?
I would explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation, and we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it?
Will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very
Just
very
looking at
infrequent.
the numbers, it actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this, and
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1 point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right. So then the question becomes, we've got 2 million people out of work. Can you stop it at 2 million people? History suggests that the Fed has a terrible track record of containing modest increases in the unemployment rate. Once the economy starts shedding jobs, it's kind of like a runaway train. It is really hard to stop. In fact, in 11 out of the 12 times that the unemployment rate increased by a full percentage point within 1 year, unemployment went on to rise another full percentage point on top of that. If that's what happens this time, we'd be looking at least 3.5 million people who would lose their jobs. So, Chair Powell, if you reach your goal and 2 million people get laid off by the end of this year, and then, just like in 11 out of 12 times that unemployment has risen by a point in a single year, it keeps on rising, and then we've got 2.5 million people out of work, we've got 3 million people who get laid off, we've got 3.5 million people who get laid off. What's your plan?
Well, Right now, the unemployment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in 54 years. And we actually don't think that we need to see a sharp or enormous increase in unemployment to get inflation under control.
I'm looking at your projections. Do you call laying off 2 million people this year not a sharp increase in
I would say
unemployment?
4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work.
We're not targeting any of that. But I would say even 4.5% unemployment is well better than most of the time for the last 75 years.
In other words, you don't have a plan to stop a runaway train if it occurs. Chair Powell, you are gambling with people's lives, and there's a pile of data showing that price gouging and supply chain kinks and the war in Ukraine are driving up prices. You cling to the idea that there's only one solution: lay off millions of workers. We need a Fed that will fight for families, and if you're not going to lead that charge, we need someone at the Fed who will.
All right, stopping that. We watched the whole thing. Very fun. So you sent me this video of Elizabeth Warren being cool and yelling at a guy, but you don't think she's cool.
No.
No. What is she saying? Things that are wrong? Is she saying things
Yes.
that are bad?
Things that are dumb.
Things that are
Really?
dumb? Are those people going to
Yeah.
get laid off?
Well, they are.
If it's in the report.
Possibly.
Okay.
It's in the projections, yes. But as they call him J-Pow in the investment community, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he's been testifying before Congress for the last few days. Now, Elizabeth Warren is yelling at him over the projected 2 million job losses that raising interest rates further will bring. And there are a couple of issues with that. The first is that, yes, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, which actually it's impossible for the Federal Reserve to achieve both at the same time. They want their dual mandate is keep inflation under control, number one, and number two, keep employment at maximum. You can't do that at the same time. If inflation is high and you have to raise rates, that's going to result in a slowdown of the economy. But that's necessary to control inflation. So essentially the Fed, and what he was trying to say is the Fed needs to continue raising rates to get inflation under control, because we were earlier this year and late last year looking at 8-9% year-over-year inflation, which is ludicrously high. At this time now, so for February, we are about 5.5% more expensive on everything. Our inflation is 5.5% compared to February of last year.
Okay.
So things are 5.5% more expensive as compared to back in September timeframe. We were looking at 8 or 9% more expensive than the previous August, September. To get that under control, the Federal Reserve has exactly two tools to combat inflation. The first one is the federal funds rate, and the second one is what I'll call the quantitative tool. The quantitative tool has two settings. The settings are easing and tightening, or you might think of that as money printing and money shredding.
Okay.
So the Fed has a balance sheet, and when it uses its quantitative tool, it either purchases bonds on the open market, which when it purchases bonds, it prints the money to purchase those bonds, and that money goes out into the market, or it sells its bonds on the open market, and the money comes back in to the Federal Reserve and is no longer circulated. The federal funds rate is the amount of interest that loaning the money generates. So the Federal Reserve prints the money, they loan the money out, there's an interest rate on it. We have enjoyed in the market about a 10-year period, or even longer maybe 15-year period of extremely low interest rates ever since we cut them to practically nothing following the crash of 2007, 2008.
Have we enjoyed that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Low interest rates do stimulate the economy. The market has gone up substantially as a result. Um, Jobs, of course, when you have low interest rates, companies expand because they can take on very cheap debt,
Okay.
and people will buy houses because if your mortgage rate is 3%, why wouldn't you?
Okay. Great. So
Uh,
low interest rates stimulate the economy.
hmm
This guy's
But
arguing that he wants to raise it.
yes,
And Elizabeth Warren says, hey, that won't stimulate the economy. We don't want that. That will lose people
well,
jobs.
he wants to raise the interest rate
Hmm.
because raising the interest rate is the only way is literally the only tool that the Federal Reserve has to get inflation under control.
Okay. And
So he has a mandate to get inflation under control,
hmm
which
so
this
he
is
has
his
to
tool.
bounce back and forth between the two, this boom and bust cycle forever, doing nothing else.
That is what the Federal Reserve does. Yes.
Okay. And then we all just pay the price for it. 2 million people lose their jobs so that this guy can get that number slightly down. I mean, honestly,
Well,
if I had the choice
it,
of paying 6% more for everything or losing my entire job, I would choose the 6% more.
well, financially speaking, if all of America has to pay 6% more, well, it was 9% until rates started rising, and the rising rates brought inflation down somewhat.
Hmm.
But if we talk about 6%, 8%, 9% for all of America versus 2 million people losing their jobs, uh, it is more expensive for Americans to have this level of inflation by far. Like the amount lost in 2 million jobs versus the amount lost to 6 or 8% inflation rate every year is enormous. Like the difference there
You're saying that
is
the
it's not even a
9% is
question.
so much more worse?
Yes, because that's 9% more expensive for 350 million Americans
Hmm.
versus 2 million people losing their jobs.
And losing like
On top of that,
all of the things and all the things and everything.
well, on top of that, as Powell was explaining, our unemployment rate is currently 3.4, which is the lowest it's been in roughly
Mm,
75 years.
that number itself is nonsense, isn't it? Because it doesn't count properly. It's
It counts people who are out of work and seeking a job.
right, but it doesn't count the
So it
people
doesn't
who
count the people that are out of work not seeking jobs. No.
who have given up or just aren't
Who've given
trying
up. Yeah, exactly. Well,
or
if, I mean, in this market, though, if you're
underemployed.
not trying, I mean, it's easy to find a job right now.
Is it?
It
Okay.
is. Yeah.
Weren't there
I also
all
want
those
to
tech
point out
jobs that just
something.
got laid off past few months? Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Um, so one thing I don't think that is being pointed out is if you have a high inflation and you are uh, lucky enough to have a job, then you're going to want more money so that you can pay for the things that are now too expensive for you to pay for any longer,
Hmm.
which means that you'll be asking your job for a raise, and they're likely to give you a raise. So now you're going to have more money to spend, and you're going to spend it on goods that will then continue to inflate, and you'll end up with much higher than 6% inflation. We've seen this in other countries that have runaway inflation,
Yeah.
where companies just give them more money so they can buy more stuff. They buy more stuff, there's more inflation, and it just gets
Okay,
ridiculous.
and the way to combat this, I'm not doubting you. I'm not doubting anything that either of you said. But the only way to avoid that is for this guy to raise interest rates, and then in doing so, what happens?
The so it's not the only way to avoid inflation. However, it is the only tool that the Federal Reserve has in its toolbox
Hmm.
to make it happen. So, could we have legislation that cuts inflation in some way? Yes. Do we do that? No.
Okay.
Is anybody actually going to pass legislation that reduces inflation? No. I think the Biden administration passed a bill, the Inflation Reduction Act,
Right.
that actually is not projected to reduce inflation at all. In fact, if it does have an impact on inflation, it'll be a 0.1% movement over the next 3 years.
Okay.
So basically nothing.
And that's because they put the wrong things in the bill, or there is
Because
nothing that what
there's
what is
nothing
it?
to eliminate inflation in it.
What legislation? Tell me simply, because I don't believe any of this shit. I think it's all smoke mirrors and horse shit, and bankers lying it to us to steal our money and gain power. I'm a little bit conspiratorial in that, but what simple thing does the government pass in legislation that lowers inflation? What is it?
To lower inflation, you would have to essentially, well, you'd have to cut our deficit. You'd have to take in more money than we spent. That'd be your first thing, is we got to stop putting money into the economy, because
So it's lower government spending.
yeah, pretty much. You gotta take money out of circulation.
Because they're giving money out to people.
Uh-huh.
And because
And
there's
that
now
money then
more
gets
of
spent.
it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that
Right.
increases inflation. Okay.
Yeah. You have to stop spending. That's the only way. That's the only way that
Okay.
so you can raise interest rates, which, because we run a debt-based economy, raising interest rates makes debt more expensive. So if you're a company and you want to expand your business, if in a low interest rate environment, you'll take a loan out at, 3, 4, 5, 6% interest rate, and you'll expand your business, and then you'll pay the loan back. But as rates increase, the federal funds rate is essentially the risk-free rate. It's never going to default on that interest. So if the risk-free rate is 5.5% or 6%, then why on earth would any bank give a loan to a company at 5.5 or 6% when they could just take a Federal Reserve note or a Treasury bond, that is, and collect the same amount, essentially? They're not. They'll loan it out to the company, but the company, because it has a default risk, they're going to loan that out at 8, 9, 10% interest, as opposed to the 3, 4, 5, 6% interest that they used to, which makes the debt much more expensive, which means that companies aren't going to spend as much, they won't borrow as much, there's less money in circulation, and so on and so forth, which is how inflation comes down. You make debt more expensive, less money is circulating in the economy. That's the whole point of these interest rates.
Okay.
Now on the subject of those 2 million jobs, we are at 3.4% unemployment, historically low the last 75 years. And even the 1% increase that those 2 million jobs represent in unemployment only brings us up to under 4.5%, which is still pretty great, actually, economically speaking.
I mean, except for those 4%.
Well,
Sucks for them, right?
That's also that I don't think that that's also a sticky number either. When you talk about the unemployment rate, I mean, there is a certain amount of churn in the economy. So those 2 million people will lose their jobs, yes, but unemployment rate of 3.5 or 4.5% means that we have a certain amount of churn. So people lose jobs all the time, and then they go find another job. They're not going to be out of work forever. Like all the same people that were unemployed, those 3.5% that were unemployed 3 months ago, back in December, are not the same people, mostly not the same people that are unemployed right now, but we still have a 3.4% rate.
Okay. Well, so there's no
Also,
way. Yeah. Go ahead.
If you have a 0% unemployment rate, then one of two things is going to happen. Either you have a shitty job working at, I don't know, someone that doesn't sponsor you, like McDonald's, and you want to leave your job, but you can't because there's no employers, because there's a 0% unemployment rate. Or
Wait, what?
you own a business and you want an employee, which is the more likely situation, but you can't get an employee, or you can't open up a new business and get employees because there's a 0% unemployment rate. So you have to steal them from someone else. Yes. So you want there to be some amount of unemployment.
Wait,
which
how does
actually
that
is
make sense?
the
If
second one makes sense. The first one doesn't.
I I don't understand. If there's 0% unemployment rate, that means there are more jobs than people.
Yes.
And if you don't like your job, go get one of those jobs because there are now more jobs than people.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of empty spaces. How do you not
That's why I'm
get
saying
to
the
leave?
first one is unlikely. The first one is saying like we have all the slots are full. There's a certain number of businesses and they have the employees they need. So it'd be impossible to move anywhere, which isn't going to happen ever. The second one is far more likely, which is where you want to go somewhere, or you want an employee, but you can't get an employee because all
Because
the
there's not
employees have
enough.
jobs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you make it more enticing. I don't know. That seems great to me. I would love for
we had this discussion before, actually. That's how we ended up with our modern healthcare system in America.
Which we will talk about in just a minute, but
we had if you recall from our healthcare debate, the way that we ended up with healthcare being intertwined with employment is during World War II, all the men left, and everybody who was still in the country, companies were competing for people to work for them.
I remember
right?
you were telling me about this, the pay caps, and the government put a
which
cap on the
resulted
pay, and then they had to give them benefits instead of
because
pay, which is nonsense. I don't think that's a good idea, but
it resulted in essentially runaway inflation in terms of the wages for employees. Which yes, that did result in the government passing wage caps, which then the companies said, okay, well, we can't pay you more wages, but we'll give you, health care instead as a benefit, and so on and so forth. So if you have too low unemployment, you get a situation like that where you end up with runaway inflation in terms of wages, which sounds great until it's not. So.
Okay. See, this is why I don't like the economics. It seems imaginary to me. Seems like my eyes glaze over, and then at the end I'm just like, yeah, do whatever you want. I assume that's how the guy got his job.
I mean, it seems imaginary until you see the real world consequences. And Jerome Powell actually worked for somebody that didn't raise interest rates fast enough or high enough, and it ended up in a huge recession. And there's some interviews with him where he seems fearful of that. So I don't know.
I actually will give Powell a lot of credit. I think he's been phenomenal as the chair of the Federal Reserve so far. He has been very measured in the rate that he's raising interest rates.
Okay.
He hasn't gone full Volcker, which, if you don't know who Volcker is, he was the chair of the Federal Reserve back in the 80s. And Volcker was like, fuck it, we're raising interest rates by 150 basis points. One go, let's do it.
And he could just do that.
Hit the button. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the Federal Reserve. That's what they can do.
And our new guy, the guy we just saw in the video, could go up by 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times what he is now. And
if he wanted to, yeah.
And it would be 10 million jobs lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's exactly what Volcker did. Is he was like, fuck it, 2%, let's go, and it immediately sent the economy into recession, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas Powell has been pretty measured. The largest hike he's done has been 75 basis points, which is 0.75% hike in interest rates.
Okay.
And he did that 3 months in a row, and then it was a 50-point basis hike a couple months in a row, and I think the last one was 25-point basis hike.
Okay.
Basis point hike.
Okay.
So, very measured.
And
Warren is really pissed off because it's going to cost 2 million jobs.
Right.
But that just goes into the job churn. I mean, at 4.5% unemployment, you're still looking at the lowest it's been in 30 years. So, I mean, you're looking at a pretty good unemployment rate, even so. Like, yeah, it does suck to lose your job, but you'll find another one. And
I think my other concern is, like, what's her answer to it? Like, is it to raise interest rates and then give companies money to keep their employees like we did during COVID-19? That seems like something that the Democrats would suggest. And that ends up in it's basically a corporate bailout.
Yeah.
And I hate to be the guy on your stream that's going to be like both sides, but this is how the Democrats give money to companies, in my opinion. The Republicans do it their own way.
They're tax
But
cuts.
what we see is our government often giving money to corporations, and that would be what I'd expect Elizabeth Warren to suggest. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that she doesn't understand what it is the Fed does or what tools the Fed has in its pocket to control inflation. Because if she did, she wouldn't be asking these questions. I think she's just dumb. I don't know. I don't know that she has any solutions in terms of controlling inflation. And actually, you can see Powell get a little frustrated with her. It's pretty hilarious. He's a very measured guy. Like, he doesn't lose his temper very often, but you see him when he throws his hand up. He's like, "What do you want us to do? Just let inflation run at 6% forever, and everybody has to pay more money."
And that's her plan. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Everybody
terrible,
pays a little bit
terrible,
more so that
ridiculous
everybody
plan.
can keep the jobs.
Terrible plan.
Okay. If you say so.
Well, think about it this way: is those people that lose their jobs will get a new job, but a
I mean,
6%
maybe.
inflation hurts everybody, and that means people that aren't working. That means seniors are hurt by inflation.
Mm-hmm.
If it means that your Social Security is now worth 6% less,
Mm-hmm.
so your spending power goes way down as a result of the inflation for not just the people that are in the employment market, which is some, what, 180, 200 million Americans. That's
Mm-hmm.
a 6% inflation rate for 350 million Americans.
Okay. I don't like economics. But you've made sense. And I didn't want you to make sense.
Sorry,
How dare you?
I do that on
How
occasion.
dare you? Oh, hi. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked what you saw, hit the like button, press the subscribe button. If you want to tell me how right I am, feel free to leave a comment. If you want to tell me how wrong I am, leave a comment too. That's good. This is just kind of a hobby for me, so I appreciate you coming by, giving it a watch, and pressing the YouTube buttons. Thanks.